Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving headfirst into humanity's relentless and, honestly, cutthroat struggle to move information faster, further, and fairer. Think about it for a second. Information is power, right? And throughout history, whoever controls the flow of that information essentially controls reality for the rest of us.
So to really grasp where we are today with our digital screens, we've got to ask a massive question. How exactly did we get from literal horses delivering war dispatches across muddy trails to the fierce modern-day legal battles over internet broadband? It's a huge leap, I know. But as we unpack this, I want you to keep one core narrative in the back of your mind. It's all about the battle over who controls the physical network that delivers our news.
Okay, let's dive into this. Here is our roadmap for today. First, the high cost of news. Then, the cooperative AP solution. After that, monopolies and the telegraph. Next, defining the common carrier. And finally, the digital age information highway.
Starting with Section 1, the high cost of news.
Picture this. The year is 1846. We are right in the middle of the bustling, totally cutthroat newspaper industry of New York City. This is an era way before digital networks or fiber-optic cables. Even widespread telegraph lines weren't really a thing yet. Information was physically scarce. If you wanted the news, someone literally had to physically carry it to you. During this penny press era, competition was aggressive, it was deeply partisan, and man, was it wildly expensive. Newspapers were out there individually chartering fast boats to meet steamships out at sea just to grab European newspapers first. Ruinously expensive. But this individualistic model was about to smack right into a monumental historical event, and that paved the way for the Associated Press model, one built on neutral, factual, and cooperative logistics.
Which brings us to Section 2, the cooperative AP solution. That massive historical event, the outbreak of the Mexican-American War in May of 1846, the public's hunger for news about this conflict was just insatiable. But the war was thousands of miles away from the Northeast media hubs. Setting up private delivery expresses was bleeding newspapers dry, costing thousands of dollars a week, a staggering fortune back then. Facing financial exhaustion, 5 fierce rivals in New York realized they had to do the unthinkable. They had to pool their resources. They chose strategic cooperation over cutthroat competition. Now, to understand how intense this logistics battle was, picture a super treacherous 60-mile stretch of land between Mobile and Montgomery, Alabama. It was a notorious bottleneck where the official U.S. mail was just painfully slow. So this newly formed Associated Press cooperative hired a fleet of their own Pony Express riders to just gallop relentlessly through this 60-mile gap. By completely bypassing the traditional mail routes, these riders beat the government's mail by a full 24 hours. And in 1846, having a 24-hour lead on war news wasn't just a win, it was an absolute eternity.
This raw, fast, verified information became so insanely valuable that a famous dispute erupted. The AP was spending immense resources to gather raw facts from the front lines, right? Well, competitors, like the International News Service, realized exactly how valuable those facts were. So what did they do? They literally started copying AP News directly off public bulletin boards and early newspaper editions. They just published that hard-earned journalism as their own without any attribution. Wild, right? The AP actually had to take legal action just to protect the flow of their verified facts.
And because the AP was serving member newspapers with vastly different political leanings, we're talking abolitionist papers to conservative ones, they simply couldn't afford to be partisan. They had to be strictly neutral. This necessity actually birthed the inverted pyramid style of journalism, putting the most absolutely vital facts right at the top. Gary Pruitt, the AP president and CEO, really hits the nail on the head here, noting that for 175 years, the world has relied on the Associated Press to report the facts. That strict neutrality, it built an enduring foundation of public trust that fundamentally shaped the professional journalism you and I still rely on today.
Moving on to Section 3, Monopolies and the Telegraph.
All right, here is where our story takes a dramatic turn. We're shifting our focus from the message, the actual news, to the medium. Think about it. What happens when private companies control the very physical networks delivering this vital news? As the telegraph began to replace the horse, the power dynamics of information completely flipped. Let's map this out chronologically and see how this builds. In 1846, we had the AP Pony Express. But as wires crossed the country, the industry consolidated really quickly. By 1866, Western Union had secured this massive monopoly on long-distance telegraph service. Congress tried to foster competition with the Telegraph Act of 1866, but, well, it largely failed.
Then came the Mann-Elkins Act in 1910, and eventually, jumping way ahead, the Telecommunications Act of 1996. The technology evolved from horses to wires to fiber optics, but that legislative scramble to keep up, that was a constant.
To really grasp the danger of these early monopolies, just imagine if your internet provider today deliberately slowed down a politician's website. Crazy, right? Well, in 1876, Western Union did exactly that. They used their unchecked telegraph monopoly to actively favor presidential candidate Rutherford B. Hayes. They gave his campaign massive advantages in reaching newspapers and even used their lines to detect the plans of his political rival. It's basically the 19th century version of today's network neutrality debate. The company owning the wires was straight up picking winners and losers based on the content flowing through them.
This brings us to Section 4, Defining the Common Carrier. So, the crucial point is this. The immense political and economic power wielded by private monopolies like Western Union and later AT&T simply couldn't go unchecked anymore. The government had to step in. Their solution? The Common Carrier Rule. Through the Mann-Elkins Act of 1910, Congress declared that telegraph and telephone companies were common carriers under the jurisdiction of the Interstate Commerce Commission. Basically, this meant they had to offer their services without discrimination to anyone willing to pay and at reasonable rates. It was a foundational rule ensuring that the physical network could not legally be used to censor or disadvantage any particular user. Equal access to the flow of information was now the law of the land for phone and telegraph lines.
But, even with common carrier rules, AT&T maintained a massive monopoly for decades. Breaking that monopoly took a series of pretty remarkable steps. First up were the Hushaphone and Cartaphone rulings. And believe it or not, the deregulation of a massive telecom monopoly basically started with a simple rubber cup. Seriously, AT&T used to strictly prohibit you from attaching anything to your phone. But the courts eventually ruled that consumers actually had the right to attach devices to the network. Step 2 was MCI finding regulatory loopholes in the 1970s to offer competing long-distance service. And finally, Step 3, the historic 1982 antitrust agreement that literally broke the massive AT&T monopoly into smaller regional Bell operating companies.
Following the AT&T divestiture and later the Telecommunications Act of 1996, the ultimate goal was to shatter that single dominant monolith and really open up the lines to competition. The 96 Act tried to let local Bell companies and long-distance companies compete in each other's markets. The whole idea was to create a diverse, competitive ecosystem of providers, rather than just having a single gatekeeper controlling all the lines.
Which leads us to our final part, Section 5, the Digital Age Information Highway.
All right, let's bring this all the way into the 21st century. We've moved from horses to telegraph wires to telephone lines, but what happens when these historical, super carefully crafted common carrier rules suddenly collide with the completely unregulated Wild West frontier of the internet? Well, under the old rules, telephone companies were tightly regulated common carriers. But the internet, it was treated differently. In 2002, the FCC classified cable broadband internet as an information service, and they later did the exact same thing for DSL. By classifying them this way, broadband providers were essentially released from those historical anti-discrimination common carriage obligations we literally just learned about. This exact regulatory classification is what sparked the intense, modern network neutrality debate. Today, we find ourselves echoing the exact same concerns people had about Western Union way back in the 19th century. Should the private companies that own the digital wires be allowed to favor certain content or applications over others?
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative question. In 1846, 5 fierce competitors realized that sharing the high costs of fax was actually better for society than weaponizing the logistics of news. Today, as fiber optics and algorithms completely replace the Pony Express and the telegraph, the mediums have evolved. But the underlying battle? It really hasn't. The physical flow of our information remains contested ground. So as we look to the future, as algorithms replace the telegraph, who will protect the unhindered, neutral flow of facts tomorrow? I want you to let that question hang in the air for a second. Think about it the very next time you tap your screen. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the Explainer. Keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.